Okay, The Wax Pack. On the Road in Search of Baseball's Afterlife by Brad Balukjian, published by University of Nebraska Press in 2020, and America's Last Great Newspaper War. The Death of Print in a Two-Tabloid Town by Mike Jaccarino, published by Fordham University Press in 2020. All right, I'm going to speak a little bit about memoir, but first I want to explain these books a little bit, right? The Wax Pack, right? Balukjian opens up a pack of baseball cards from 1986, and I think it's something like 14 players, 13 of them are still alive, and he decides to sort of travel across the country in his beat up 2002 Honda Accord with like 150,000 miles on it, to interview all these ball players, all these ex-ball players, to see what's become of them. You know, where are they now? Type of book. You know, how do people deal with the fact that, you know, they're never ever going to do anything as well as they did in their 30s? That's another thing. Balukjian's 34, which is about the age when most ball players retire, right? And you know, you got to be a baseball fan to like the book. That's for sure. But you know, it's like a string of really well done magazine feature pieces. 13 of them. Some of the ball players. There's, I think, there's Doc Gooden. There's Carlton Fisk. Some of these players he doesn't end up meeting, but that kind of adds to the suspense. There's Rick Sutcliffe. There's Steve Yeager. There's Lee Mazzilli, who was one of my heroes when I was growing up. The other book, America's Last Great Newspaper War. Jaccarino is a runner, which is basically a news chaser for the New York Daily News, which is one of the two tabloids of the city. The other is the Post. The Daily News is sort of like the long-standing champ of tabloid journalism in New York, and the Post is the upstart. But at the start of this book, which is around October of 2006, is I think when Jaccarino gets his job, the Post has just surpassed the News in circulation. So it becomes a war for who's sort of like the #1 newspaper in New York. You know, he gets his job. He gets his job because he kind of cajoles a Monsignor into like talking shit on Cardinal Egan about the handling of the abuse crisis in the church. And you know, Jaccarino kind of uses his Catholic background as a way to kind of con this Monsignor into giving him the scoop, and then the Monsignor recants, and Jaccarino won't let him, and this is how he gets the job at the News. One of the fascinating things about the book is that you know, Jaccarino is a player in this story. You know, like, he is one of the best at what he does. I mean, at one point he chases OJ after OJ gets accused of, you know, assault against a memorabilia collector, or you know, he's hunting down quotes after 2 cops get shot in broad daylight in the outer boroughs, or and so you see him kind of like, you see him con these people into like burying their souls when they're most vulnerable, after either experiencing some tragedy, or the wife of some baseball star who is recently run over someone in a drunk driving incident, or his ex-wives, and you know, you got the kids in the background, and Jaccarino is kind of like trying to say the right thing or provoke them into sort of revealing themselves. And you know, he doesn't come off as an asshole. That's one of the amazing things. I mean, he's totally straight up about this. He's an excellent writer. The guy can really paint a picture. He can describe a scene. He can turn a phrase. Like, I think he says at one point, like, more gaudy than a 1980s rock anthem, or another line is like, he describes a building as architectural lasagna. I mean, sometimes he goes overboard. I think at one point he says, I'm more weary than 3 sled dogs in a Jack London novel. I don't know about that. I don't know about that simile. But, you know, he's got the kind of tabloid New Yorker voice, you know, and the book is kind of peppered with headlines. I mean, the headline writers for these tabloids, I mean, they were like the stars of Twitter before Twitter even existed. I mean, some of these headlines are like just art in like 6 words, you know? I don't know, I mean, speaking of memoir, I mean, he's there, man, in the scenes. You see him like working these people. You know, he talks about how, you know, he doesn't see the humanity in human beings. He sees them as like for their news value. And he talks about how the moment you see the humanity in his news subjects, like you lose your edge. You can't get quotes. It really is memoir. I mean, you're living this life with him. You live in this life with him. And it's kind of amazing, like on the book jacket, like the word memoir is kind of buried in the book jacket text. It's sort of billed more as a book about this newspaper war. While, for example, in the wax pack, you know, I mean, the memoir aspect of the book, and it does on the book jacket copy, like bill itself as a memoir, like, you know, Balukjian is, you know, retracing his past and re-encountering himself with old loves, or, you know, coming to terms with obsessive-compulsive disorder. I don't know, man. I mean, to me, I mean, that's the weak part of the book. I mean, it seems like an add-on. You know, he doesn't really, we don't really live his obsessive-compulsive disorder, for example. I mean, he talks about how he kind of obsesses over like leaving the pot on the stove, or, you know, getting HIV, you know, and he talks a little bit about his therapy and so forth, but he sums it up. You know, he doesn't, we don't live it with him, you know, like there's a scene where he goes to see Lee Mazzilli, and, you know, he brings his dad with him, and his dad, you know, he talks a little bit about how his dad when he was young at ball games, he always felt safe and secure, and, you know, but life is more messy than that, and, you know, he wants to, you know, have emotional discussions with his dad, and he talks about, I think the quote is something about how, you know, our conversations always orbit around some emotional sphere, but we only end up scratching the surface. We don't blast into its core or something like that. That seems to me to be exactly what this book does in terms of memoir. It sort of just scratches the surface of his story. It scratches the surface of what obsessive-compulsive disorder is. It doesn't really blast into its core. You know, like he'll be talking with his dad, and suddenly, you know, he'll finally like open up and be vulnerable and bare his soul, and, you know, you get this long speech that doesn't read like anything anyone would say in real life, and then, you know, his father says, I'm proud of you for who you are, and then, you know, the writer feels like an unclenched fist. I mean, I wouldn't say that the book, you know, uses cliche, but there's a lot of rote phrasings, a lot of rote phrases that make it seem kind of makes it seem kind of too neat. Like, you know, you can't just sum this stuff up so easily. Like, I suspect the authenticity of anything that can be summed up so easily, you know? And I don't think Jaccarino ever tries to sum up his life. He kind of is like a little bit kind of in awe before what made him good at this job. You know, he kind of is, you know, trying to struggle to make sense of it. Whereas, you know, you get the sense that Balukjian sort of feels like he understands it all now. And like when he goes back and, you know, meets his old girlfriend and talks about, you know, when he finally got over his depression, you know, it was like stepping back into color. I mean, those type of phrases, yeah, I could see even people liking them. You know, like I said, it's got this kind of magazine piece feel, which makes it totally readable. And I'm not talking shit on this book. This book was fun to read. I enjoyed reading this book. I enjoyed reading it. But I got kind of annoyed in the parts about memoir. I mean, like, maybe he should have written a memoir as a different book, not here. I don't think the mix works well, you know, whereas, like, you know, with Jaccarino's book, I mean, he is definitely part of the story. There's absolutely no doubt about that. you know? There's no doubt about that. So would I recommend these books? Yes, I would recommend them both. I mean, I think people who really love memoir, who really want to know what it's like to live in someone else's skin, well, I think they're probably going to be disappointed by Balukjian's book, but they won't be disappointed by Jaccarino's book. Anyway, have a good one.